Terrorist attacks can shake the foundations of our biggest buildings, but they cannot touch the foundation of America. These acts shatter steel, but they cannot dent the steel of American resolve.
Stand beside her and guide her through the night with the light from above.
This is a vicious attack upon New York. It's an attack upon America. It's an attack upon the whole concept of freedom and our way of life. And we cannot let these attacks succeed.
From the mountains to the prairies to the oceans, white with foam.
Our hearts go out to all the victims and to their families. It is a tragedy, but as the President has made clear, it is a tragedy that we are strong enough to overcome. Our spirits will not be broken.
We are, in a sense, seeing the definition of a new battlefield in the world, a 21st century battlefield.
God bless America, my home, sweet home.
New York is going to be here, and we're going to rebuild, and we're going to be stronger than we were before.
God bless America, my home, sweet home.
Hi, everybody. I'm John Gibson, and this is Fox News continuing coverage. Terrorism hits America. Here is the latest. We'll put it on the screen. The New York and New Jersey Port Authority says that casualties are expected to top 20,000 in the World Trade Center bombing. Casualties defined as both dead and injured. The State Department issues a worldwide caution for Americans anywhere in the world because a threat still exists. David Lee Miller joins us now. Here are some more. Before we go to David Lee Miller, the feds are considering armed law enforcement agents on all flights in this country. It's called Sky Marshals. The Department of Justice, search warrants are executed in more than 3 states, including Massachusetts, Florida, and New Jersey. And there is a possibility some hijackers posed as pilots to gain access to cockpits. The FBI says that the World Trade Center crime scene is unworkable because of dangers to agents and rescuers. Now, as I was saying, David Lee Miller joins us now from Ground Zero at the World Trade Center, where rescue operations continue throughout the night. Hi, David.
Hi there, John. It has been now almost 2 days since the attack on the World Trade Center, and we are told that a total of only 9 survivors now have been plucked from the rubble. One of them, though, an absolutely miraculous story. A police officer for the Port Authority here, his name John McLaughlin. He was on the 82nd floor when suddenly the building underneath him collapsed. It gave way, and he rode that debris all the way to the ground. His injuries: broken legs and shattered ankles. An absolutely incredible story. And just a short time ago, we had the opportunity to talk to Dr. Emil Chin. He's one of the volunteers here at the site, and he personally treated 4 of the other survivors and said there could be more.
In the rubble, there's actually some big cavities that they're going into now with canine corps. There's a search and rescue team with dogs from Massachusetts that's down here. And I think there's always a hope for a limited number of survivors, even days after the accident.
Tell me, what have you seen? You say you have personally encountered 4 survivors.
I was here about 12 hours yesterday and almost 12 hours today. I saw 2 yesterday and 2 today. So they're coming in a very slow trickle, but we're always hopeful for more.
Can you tell us more about them? Were they conscious? Did they talk? What condition were they in?
I remember one woman was in pretty good condition. So it seems like the people are either doing very well, or unfortunately there seem to be fatalities, but not that much in between. We have not yet had to do any surgery at the scene ourselves. They're just going to hospitals by ambulance.
And from a medical perspective, what is the scene like down there?
It's a little bit chaotic, but it's really encouraging because there's so many different specialties volunteering. I'm volunteering today, and I would say the majority of the doctors are here as volunteers.
You said you had some thoughts about people having the right to see close up the site.
I think it does a disservice to the American people not to have media access right at the scene, as long as it's secure and it doesn't jeopardize any national security, because what you see from far away, the shots that I'm seeing, it does not describe the horrific nature of the trauma, both physically, in terms of life, in terms of psychological trauma, of all the rescue workers, the victims. You have to be up close. It looks like a volcano went off, not a bomb. There's ash knee deep. It's the craziest thing you've ever seen, and the American public needs to see it. They need to see what has been done to this country.
I'm not sure that many Americans would actually like to see the disaster site. Personally, we got a statistic from authorities a few hours ago upping the number of fatalities. They are now estimating it could be over 20,000 here at the World Trade Center. And John, we've also gotten word that New York City's Mayor Rudy Giuliani is asking the federal government to supplement the city's supply of body bags and to come up with another 6,000. Back to you.
David, back to Dr. Chin's comments about the American public seeing the scene at the World Trade Center. I'm a little confused. Are we not seeing what he's talking about? Are we not able to get cameras close enough to see that those scenes that he described to you?
Well, it was his opinion that the shots that he has seen, which are the pictures we've been showing you regularly and the other networks have as well, are just too far away. He says you really have to stand there up close and personal and observe this devastation, which he describes as horrific. He says that the TV pictures just don't convey that emotion. But I think even if we did that, from what I'm hearing, John, from a lot of these workers, television is only a two-dimensional medium. It still wouldn't be enough to convey the real horror. When you stand even where I am and you smell the air and you breathe in now what might be asbestos particles in the air, you really understand, not just in your brain but in your heart, what has happened to this country. John?
David Lee Miller, down at the scene of the World Trade Center bombing. David, thanks very much. Joining us now from Washington, Fox News senior correspondent Rita Cosby with more on the investigation as to what happened. Rita, what do we know?
Well, John, law enforcement sources are telling me that they are almost certain that indicted terrorist Osama bin Laden is behind the deadly hijackings, and they are quickly getting some significant leads. Law enforcement officials say that they have the names of virtually all of the hijackers. Sources say that they got the names with the help of the plane's manifests and also intercepted cell phone calls. Fox News has learned that at least one of the hijackers was previously known to authorities as a supporter of bin Laden's. Sources also say that the hijackers were mainly Egyptian and Saudi nationals, the two groups that comprise a good portion of bin Laden's followers. Now, investigators tonight are following the paper trail. Some of the passenger tickets purchased by the hijackers were, I'm told, bought in cash. But in one case, sources say that a single credit card was used to buy tickets for 7 of the hijackers. Also, a car left at Boston Airport, Logan Airport there, containing technical flight training information, led authorities to a flight training school in southern Florida. 4 of the men who authorities believe participated in the hijacking of the Twin Towers in New York lived in southern Florida and at some point were trained at 2 separate training schools there. Heavily armed authorities also stormed a Boston hotel today. There they found, according to sources, a vacant hotel room rented out by one of the hijackers. They also took 3 men into custody. One law enforcement source telling me tonight that the men have been released, that there was not sufficient evidence to hold any of them at this point, but that they're still going to keep an eye on them and also others. An Amtrak train from Boston to Washington was also held up for 2 hours in Providence, Rhode Island. Now, the mayor there tells Fox News that one man was arrested, the man you see there, on weapons charges. Sources now say that this may not be related to the hijackings, that they're still looking into this. Authorities are rounding up individuals, I'm told, in at least 5 states, including also in Pennsylvania, Maine, and also New Jersey, trying to get people with possible ties to bin Laden behind bars, even on immigration offenses, whatever offenses they could, in hopes of preventing any possible future attacks, and also in hopes of getting valuable information leading to who they believe masterminded this highly sophisticated attack. John?
Rita Cosby in Washington with the latest on the investigation. Rita, thanks very much. Meantime, Fox News correspondent Brian Wilson joins us live from the Pentagon. Brian?
Yes, the cleanup continues here. They're trying to find the right balance here between going in and destroying a crime scene and also trying to stabilize the situation. Now, the feeling here is that no one has survived, that there will be no survivors pulled from the debris here. That's because the impact, the fire, the smoke over the last day and a half was just too much. that no one could have survived it. And now the question is, what do they do next? And there seems to be some concern about the stability of the building. They're trying to shore it up, doing the best they can to make it in a more stable situation before they go in depth. Also today, a rather poignant moment this afternoon, as workers climbed to the very top of the south side of the Pentagon, not too far from where the plane impacted the south side of the Pentagon building, and unfurled a giant flag. And I must tell you, as I came to work today, all over Washington, in neighborhoods, hanging from overpasses, the American flag is on display in this city. A patriotic display, and here on the Pentagon, a patriotic gesture at a time when the nation is still reeling from the events of the past day or so. Now, the area around the Pentagon has been locked down, but only recently have they opened up the streets to the public, and it seems the public is coming by to take a look. For the first time since a plane crashed into the side of the Pentagon, folks were allowed to get close enough to see the damage firsthand. It was an unusual mix of people on this night. Sure, there were those who came to see the bright lights and the media trucks, but others came almost out of a sense of obligation.
And in fact, my daughter said, "Do you think we're being disrespectful to come down and look? Because I don't want to appear that we're gawking." And I said, "No, I really think we're showing our respect."
Still others came because they couldn't quite believe what they had seen on television.
Like anything else, the pictures on TV don't do justice to the scene, and it doesn't seem real until you come down here and look at it.
As you might imagine, some people were just angry and wanted to vent.
It's a shame. It's a shame, and whoever did it, hey, we're gonna get you.
And then there were the people who came to explain the unexplainable to their children. And the children seemed to understand.
People have just lost everyone, like their moms and dads in this, so it's just sad like that. So that's just what I think.
Isn't it funny how the young children, even though they may not understand or grasp everything that they see, get the real basic here, that there's been a human loss of life, and that some people will not have their mommies and daddies coming home. A poignant comment from a very young viewer of the damage tonight. We're here in front of the Pentagon where the work continues, and the death toll now stands at 80. John, back to you.
Brian Wilson at the Pentagon. Brian, thanks a lot. More details coming in now about what happened on those 4 doomed hijacked airplanes. Passengers made chilling cell phone calls to 911 and to loved ones. Steve Brown reports.
As terrorists took over 4 flights Tuesday, passengers and crew members used cell phones to reach out with urgent cries for help, with information for authorities, or with last-second words of love for family members. Mark Bingham was aboard United Flight 93, which had left Newark for San Francisco. He reached family members at home.
He just said, "I want to let you all know that I love you very, very much in case I don't see you again."
I said that.
That the plane has been taken over by hijackers. And then I said, "Well, we love you very much too, Mark. Let me go get your mother."
An unidentified man hiding in a bathroom aboard Flight 93 dialed 911 on his cell phone to reach a dispatcher outside Pittsburgh. "We are being hijacked. We are being hijacked. This is not a joke," he said, before his phone went dead. Aboard the same flight, Lauren Grancolis, on her way home to San Francisco from her grandmother's funeral in New Jersey, was able to reach her husband, Jack. "We have been hijacked," she told him. "They are being kind. I love you." Flight attendant C.C. Ross of Fort Myers, Florida, put through a panicked call to her husband, Lauren Lyles, who had just gotten their 2 sons off to school. He heard screams in the background as she told him, "We've been hijacked. I love you. I love the children." Still on Flight 93, Thomas Burnett called his wife Dina and told her of a final act of resistance to terror. "I know we're all going to die. There's 3 of us who are going to do something about it," he said. Flight 93 was the only plane that didn't reach its target, crashing into an empty field in southern Pennsylvania. Peter Hansen of Groton, Massachusetts, was aboard United Flight 175 with his wife and their 3-year-old daughter as it left Boston for Los Angeles. He reached his father in Connecticut. Hansen told his parents he knew they were all going to die, but he tried to reassure them. "Don't worry about us. It's going to be quick," Hansen told his father. United Flight 175 was the second plane to crash into the World Trade Center. Fox News commentator Barbara Olson was aboard American Airlines Flight 77 as it left Washington for Los Angeles. She was able to place 2 calls to her husband, Theodore Olson, the U.S. Solicitor General. Our plane is being hijacked. She then asked, "What should I tell the pilot?" The call was cut off, but she immediately called back to ask again, "What should I tell the pilot?" Those were her final words, as minutes later, American Flight 77 became a massive missile and crashed into the Pentagon. Steve Brown, Fox News.
Joining us now, counterterrorism and Middle East expert Brian Jenkins. Brian is a former member of the Clinton administration's Commission on Aviation Safety and Security. Brian, I hardly know where to begin, but let's talk about those cell phone calls. It sounds as though, to me, and maybe to you as well, you can tell me, if that plane that crashed outside of Pittsburgh might have made it to Washington, might have hit a target if the passengers hadn't conducted what amounts to a mutiny of their hijacking.
It certainly seems that way. The natural reaction of passengers in a hijacked aircraft, and normally quite sensibly so, is to remain passive and to not attempt to confront the hijackers. In this particular case, however, they did so, and their heroism, in fact, is probably saved hundreds, if not thousands, of more lives.
Because the plane undoubtedly was headed for some other dramatic target, do you think?
I suspect so. I mean, we don't know what that target was, whether it was going to be another plane into the Pentagon, whether it was going to be aimed at the White House, whether it would crash somewhere else in Washington, the Capitol. We don't know. But the fact is it went down in a field in Pennsylvania, which was certainly a tragedy for the passengers on board, but, as I say, saved the lives of many hundreds, perhaps thousands of others.
Okay, Brian, let's back up. We are now talking about declaring an act of war against Osama bin Laden and the countries that harbor him, whichever ones those might be. Are we swinging at air here? Is there something in particular to hit?
Well, there's going to be undeniably some frustration between the shock that turns to grief, that will turn to anger as we become fully aware of the magnitude of these losses and, in fact, begin to see the visual images of thousands of caskets and funerals. That fury is going to demand a response. The administration is preparing a response. And that response is probably going to exceed the kinds of responses that we've seen in the past. This is not going to be a single salvo of cruise missiles, but rather the beginning of an ongoing campaign. But the frustration is that that is a war that is directed against a network. It's directed against cells of fanatics. There are not going to be any landings on Normandy beaches here. There's not going to be eventually anybody that steps out on the decks of a battleship and signs a surrender.
But is there going to be a scene like the one we're looking at now, this utter destruction of what amounts to a World War III scene in someone else's country?
Probably not, nor do I think that the American people would desire that we respond to an act of terrorism such as this by simply wantonly killing civilians in other countries. However much our emotions and anger may be aroused by this, that is not an appropriate monument to those who were killed. We should take every measure that we can to identify those who were responsible, those who assisted them, to break up other terrorist cells that may exist. I mean, one thing that's important to keep in mind here, as your own earlier report underlined, preparations for this operation began months ago when people began training for flying training. We do not know at this very moment how many other cells may exist around the world of individuals who are ready, perhaps even in the process of preparing to carry out additional actions.
Okay, let's go to the other area of your expertise, and that is aviation security and safety. It probably goes without saying that we've been unnecessarily lax in our security in commercial aviation. But what is the new world going to look like when we finally go back into the air in a few days? How are we going to be assuring our security now that we've seen this?
Well, clearly, these events will call for a wholesale review of the security measures in place, and we'll have to try to put together more details about exactly how this took place. Did these people smuggle on board something that they should not have had on board, or are the procedures inadequate to prevent otherwise harmless-looking objects, cardboard cutters described in one of the cell phone calls, from coming on board? Did they have the assistance of suborned members of the ground staff? All of those will be investigated. On the basis of that investigation, then we can look and to see what precise vulnerabilities were exploited in this particular set of hijackings and what we might do to improve the situation. There is no question that we need to improve aviation security. The biggest problem has not been lack of ideas. In fact, the biggest problem hasn't even been the lack of measures that we have recommended in the past. The biggest problem has been complacency.
Right. Complacency. All right, Brian Jenkins, terror expert. Thanks very much, Brian. We appreciate you coming in tonight. Joining us now from Washington, Stephen Emerson. He's with a group called Investigative Project, which researches international terrorism. Stephen, before I get into your direct area of expertise, just segueing from Brian Jenkins, there are techniques the Israelis use on El Al. We don't see a whole lot of El Al hijackings anymore. And that may be a model for our new aviation world. What do they do that's so different from what we have been doing?
They do two things. One is they do certain types of psychological profiling of all types of people traveling on the planes to determine whether they look the part, whether they're traveling alone, where they've traveled before. And they make an instant determination whether that profile merits an exhaustive examination of everything in their baggage, including squeezing sometimes the toothpaste out of a toothpaste tube. So that process can take a while. That's why they advise people going to El Al to get there sometimes 2.5 hours ahead of time. And I think that type of intrusive inspection of our own personal belongings, as well as the willingness to endure a certain type of profiling, is the key to the success of the Israeli airline security success story.
Stephen, into your main area of expertise, who did this, why they did it, and whether actions we take might deter them from doing it in the future. Are there things we can do to stop this?
Listen, you've raised very good questions. I wish I had magical answers. There's no doubt that the evidence, the indication, the wherewithal clearly points to Osama bin Laden and his disciples. Whether we'll ever find the magical connection as we found in the embassy bombings in Kenya and Tanzania is probably doubtful at this point, because in Kenya and Tanzania they captured several of the would-be suicide bombers because they never blew themselves up, and they talked eventually, and some of them even confessed. Here, the FBI is no doubtedly going to round up the people that assisted in this. I mean, I have a list that I brought with me of some of the names of the hijackers. They've got actually one of the hijackers actually secured his reservations for the flight through a Kinko's, and they've traced the IP, the Internet protocol address, so they know exactly where it was made. The FBI is doing an extraordinary job tonight, and will be for the foreseeable future. Now, you raise another question: can we stop it? I don't know. I do know this, that the answer is not going to be found in one, as Brian Jenkins said, in one cruise missile strike. It's going to be a sustained war. It's going to take years. We've got to build up our deterrence and intelligence. And those are the two things. We can't just build security, because if we just build security, they'll do car bombs in Washington. The idea here is to really rebuild our human intelligence, our connections, which has been really decimated, and two, build up deterrence. In other words, show that we will not allow Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Lebanon, and other countries to sort of, not be as forceful as they could with terrorists. We will confront the entire network of militant Islamic fundamentalists,
Stephen,
wherever they are.
Hold on a second. I've got to interrupt you. We're going to pause for just a moment here so some of our Fox stations can leave us for their local news, but we are going to continue. Let's just pause. As we look at a scene of the of the rescue workers going through the rubble at the World Trade Center. I mean, we're at this point down there where they're really going through the stuff not only with big front-end loaders and cranes, but by hand. I mean, you can see people with buckets of dirt and bucket brigades passing the buckets along and digging away, looking for both the people who were killed and with any luck, some survivors. Stephen Emerson, terrorism expert. Stephen, I guess what I was asking, and maybe you can tell, are we at in a war with the Muslim world at large? That we're just never, ever going to all get along, in Rodney King's phrase, and that there's just going to be somebody mad at us all the time, and so mad they're going to try to do things like this all the time, no matter what.
Look, there's no doubt that there are going to be people angry at us at all times because of who we are, because we're Americans, because we're democracy, because we've got separation of church and state, because we're infidels, we're apostates, whatever. But I do believe that the vast majority of the Muslim world, with the right leadership in their own countries, with the right encouragement and carrot and stick approach, can be made to see the fact that their alliance with the West is the only wave of the future. And the fact of the matter is that countries like Afghanistan and the Taliban, which support and protect the bin Laden, Pakistan, which has this quasi-love-hate relationship with bin Laden, these countries have to be made to know that their price of support for bin Laden is going to be the price of economic investment or political isolation. We have to be willing to stop politicizing terrorism, to basically adopt across-the-board doctrine with our Western allies. And I think now we have an opportunity for the first time ever to get Western support, European support. They've been traditionally reluctant to support our anti-terrorism. Now I think we have a window of opportunity to get them to go along. There's no guarantee that it's going to work. This is not a war against Islam. This is a war against militant Islam. The vast majority of Muslims are not interested in fighting a war with the West. They're interested in the same things you and I are interested in. But it is definitely a war that we have to declare against bin Laden, Hamas, Hezbollah, the whole spectrum of groups that operate worldwide with the intention of annihilating the United States or Western values and ideals.
Okay, so what happens next? The president is getting his allies all lined up behind him. Actually, I think a lot of people are kind of surprised he's taken as long as he is to strike somebody. So what happens next? What is your prediction?
It's hard to predict here. I think, one, there's obviously a waiting to determine whether they have the sufficient intelligence to launch a military response against bin Laden's camps in Afghanistan. And I believe they have identified with very sufficient clarity the exact location of those camps. Whether they could ever get bin Laden himself is very unclear.
What about other countries?
Look, well, the president was very clear that he said that he will get the terrorists and those who harbor and protect them. And the fact of the matter is that there are other countries that have done this. And we have got to be willing to sort of cash in our chits with the Saudis, with the Egyptians, that will stop the Saudis from, turning a blind eye to some of the bank accounts that bin Laden has in his country, and to stop and to demand that they allow extradition to the United States of terrorists to blow up other Marine barracks or U.S. barracks. Look, it's not going to be a 1, 2, 3 punch. It's not the traditional war, and that's what we have to understand. This could take 3, 4, 5 years. It took bin Laden 10 years to develop the capability that he had to commit this horrific crime yesterday. It's going to take us several years to restore the balance of deterrence, to make sure that his protectors, and he has state protectors, understand that the price of supporting him is simply not worth it. And that means we're going to have to go it alone or go with the Europeans. We're going to have to be willing to use military, economic, political isolation, as well as stop some of the networks from operating in the United States. And that's going to raise questions about whether we lower the threshold about investigating groups that advocate violence. Right now, you can advocate destruction of the United States, call for death to America, in Chicago or Washington, D.C. or Detroit, and you're protected.
Stephen Emerson, I'm out of time. Thanks very much for joining us. Stephen Emerson, terrorism expert. We are going to continue. Stephen Emerson says it's going to take years. It seems like years already, and it's only been a day or so. With us now, Fox News senior business correspondent Brenda Butner to talk about the huge ramifications of these incredible acts of terror on our markets. The markets are now talking about opening up on Friday or maybe Monday?
Friday at the earliest, yes, Monday at the latest. There really is a very difficult balancing act because they don't want the efforts to resurrect the markets and the ability to effectively transmit transactions to in any way interfere with the recovery efforts. But they also want to send a clear signal. When that opening bell finally rings on either Friday or Monday, it's going to send a signal to the terrorists that, yes, you can go ahead and fell buildings, but you cannot take down the freest and fairest market in the world. And that is intended to be a symbol of defiance in many ways. So they're really balancing between those two issues. Right now, we see that the overseas markets are trading. Thailand, Malaysia, and Taiwan are taking some significant dips, but that's basically because they didn't trade last night. The other markets that did have some downturn last night are all stabilizing. You can almost hear them holding their breath, waiting to see what happens in the United States.
Get back to that in just a second. But in the meantime, the World Trade Center had a huge number of people directly involved in the major companies of the financial markets. We've gotten some kind of good news. I think it was Morgan Stanley said a lot of their people are accounted for, and that they didn't. That Morgan Stanley didn't simply disappear. But what about I don't know, hundreds of other companies in that building? Is word trickling out about people getting out safely?
Word is trickling out that wonderful rescue stories and heroic efforts to save people, but also, unfortunately, there are many losses. People that we have known very well, that we've interviewed on our air, who were just trapped and never made it out. So there is that flip side as well to the stories of safety.
So, Brenda, this thing has a kind of a ripple effect through the economy and through the business psyche and so forth. Is it predictable?
It's predictable in that basically we have shrugged off other acts of terrorism and of war. The markets have. We've seen a quick downturn and then the market just keeps going up. That's important to recognize. But we've never seen something of this magnitude. A lot of it is going to depend on the consumer. Will the consumer rally around and say, we are not going to take this, we are not going to sit up and zip up our wallets, we're going to continue to trade, we're going to continue to spend, or will this be the shock that this economy did not need, this very vulnerable economy?
Brenda Butner, taking a look at what's going to happen when the markets eventually get around to opening, either Friday at the earliest or at Monday if things don't go as well as everybody would like. Brenda, thanks for staying up. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
New York's business district, as Brenda has been saying, will never be the same as the Twin Towers are lost forever. But the buildings initially survived an impact that would have instantly destroyed most skyscrapers and bought enough time to save many lives. Claudia Cowan has that story.
Once the jewels of New York's skyline, the World Trade Center towers stood up against terrorism long enough to save countless lives.
The plane came through, it took out a few of the exterior columns of the building and then set off this massive fire with the jet fuel. And fortunately, because of the perimeter tube system of the building, it was able to withstand the initial impact and allow a lot of people to get out.
Other buildings would have toppled immediately, but the towers remained upright for nearly an hour, supported on the outside by closely spaced steel columns and struts, and on the inside by a second set of columns designed to bear the load of gravity. A double support system that withstood the crash, but not the raging jet fuel fire.
The girders or the joists that hold up the floors collapsed, and as those fell to the floor below, they overwhelmed the capacity of that floor, and we had was what we call a progressive collapse, which then continued on through the base of the building until it was a complete and total failure.
Most experts say tall buildings will continue to be made out of steel. What may change, they say, is the design of signature skyscrapers, the tallest and most exposed buildings. They may never be built in quite the same way.
It's not like we could ever design every building for this scenario, or should we? But after every major earthquake, for example, we change our building codes to improve our practice in the future, and I would expect a similar thing will happen here.
One possibility, designs that include more escape routes around the perimeter of the building as well as in the center. But experts say no building can withstand an attack by a pilot willing to die for a cause. The challenge ahead, simply finding ways to reduce the loss of life. In San Francisco, Claudia Cowan, Fox News.
Just a side note to that story, the Wall Street Journal reporting today that the steel in those buildings is designed to accept 800 degrees temperature, melts at 1,500 degrees, and the jet fuel fire produced 2,000 degrees. Our next guest is an expert in the study of hate and extremism. Brian Levin used to be with the New York Police Department, now a professor at Cal State University. So, Brian, you know, there's still a situation today that was alluded to by Secretary of Transportation Norman Mineta. He wanted to open the nation's air system at noon. He was convinced by the security experts he should not. What he didn't say, but hinted at, is there's still some guys running around that they're not quite sure about, or they're not quite sure there aren't guys running around who want to carry out further attacks as soon as planes are back in the air. What do you know about this crazed determination to do this kind of damage from these people?
Well, we know that religiously motivated zealots who bastardize religions are the hardest to deter and the hardest to infiltrate. And if there is intel, and it appeared when he was questioned, I saw that exact press conference, when he was pressed, he basically said, look, this is a law enforcement security thing rather than an administrative preparation kind of thing. And I think they did the responsible thing. Look, I just drove 450 miles from San Francisco to be here with you tonight. I think sometimes prudence, even if it inconveniences people, is the best way to go. And if he's relying on some decent intel...
okay, but read between the lines.
Yeah.
Is the Secretary of Transportation, Norm Mineta, saying, we can't put planes in the sky in this nation or let planes land from elsewhere in this nation because on the loose are still more elements of the Osama bin Laden organization that carried out these 4 hijackings and these terror attacks on the Pentagon and the World Trade Center?
Well, I think we've had people on the loose for some time. But the fact of the matter is, when you have an event of this magnitude, I don't think he has a choice other than to be prudent. And even if there is a possibility and there's some reasonable intel on it, I think he did exactly the right thing. That doesn't mean, you know, we should shut down all the post offices and all the banks and everything. But when it comes to the instrumentality that was used in the worst act of terrorism in American history, I think it's prudent to wait a few days until we can scramble our resources together and find out exactly what this represents.
Okay, Brian, now, about the people who do this, is it necessary to merely threaten them with overwhelming violence, or do the individuals have to be the victims of overwhelming violence in order to stop this? In other words, you go around and bomb a few places and make life difficult. Will they stop, or do you have to actually get these people?
Well, the problem is there are legions of people throughout the world who loathe the United States and would gladly give their lives in the process. The thing here is, this isn't some 22-year-old with a backpack with a pipe bomb and shrapnel. We're talking about someone who not only had the motive, but a network and resources. So I think what has to be done is we have to be very careful to do our homework, find out who's responsible, who has the resources, and then be very careful with a proportionate response. But I think, again, we should step back a little bit and not shoot from the hip and potentially alienate those who might be our allies. Let me
like who?
Well, let me just give you an example.
I mean, have we potential friends in Iraq we could alienate by bombing Iraq for some complicity in this thing?
Well, first of all, we don't know if Iraq has any complicity.
Well, let's just say we do. Let's just say it's the usual suspects, Brian. What is the point of staying our hand?
Oh, I don't think we should stay our hand. But what I think we do have to do, and maybe this is where I'm diverging with you a bit, is we have to make sure that we have persuasive evidence as to who did this. But for instance, if we attacked Iraq, for instance, and we didn't have a basis for connecting them to this, I think that there would be extreme political fallout, particularly because we're going to need the cooperation of moderate or the more moderate Middle Eastern countries in pursuing this. And again, I think Emerson was right in the fact that this is something that's going to take years. It's going to take intel on the ground, which you have to develop over some time. And I think that's why, you know, it's important sometimes to walk softly and carry a big stick. But when we do identify those responsible, I think it's important to do a
Brian, look,
response.
you're an expert in this area. Here's a quote from Osama bin Laden, who says he didn't actually have anything to do with it, but reacting to the news that this has happened. This was, of course, a television reporter in Abu Dhabi, the bureau chief there for Abu Dhabi television, says that Osama bin Laden thanked Almighty Allah and bowed before him when he heard this news, but he went on to say he didn't really have anything to do with it himself. He's just very happy that it happened. Now, okay, we all know we want to go after Osama bin Laden. That's no big news. And if we had to, you know, bomb most of Afghanistan, I don't suppose anybody would be very shocked.
Whoa. Hold on a second. One of the things I think we have to step back and recognize is that many of these countries are under extreme tensions themselves. Algeria, for instance, has had a civil war with tens of thousands dead because there were extreme zealots out there, and Afghanistan too. A main lieutenant in the opposition to the Taliban was killed by a bomb the other week. So
a Taliban bomb, right?
Right. So if we quote unquote carpet bomb Afghanistan, we're going to first of all hurt many.
No, but we would bomb. I mean, you talk about proportionality. I just remind you that we might have 10,000 body bags here. That proportionality is now a new has a new definition. We would attack the Taliban, who has been hosting. The euphemism is Osama bin Laden is a guest of the Taliban. Look. We would attack them for their hosting of bin Laden, wouldn't we?
I think the precursor to all this is that we have to establish a link. Look, I happen to agree with you in a speculative way that bin Laden is behind this. I don't disagree with you there.
What's the link? I mean, we have a link today that the people that got on the planes in Boston and hijacked the planes there, that one or more of them had some connection to bin Laden. So what kind of link is it that the world wants us to produce in order to justify our lashing back at a number of, over an incident of a number of casualties bigger than the Normandy invasion?
Look, and my dad was in the Normandy invasion. Look, I happen to agree with you in your main point, but in the details I diverge from you. Let me tell you what I mean. Because someone might be a fellow traveler is different from someone who is connected to an interlinked bunch of networks that finds its way back to bin Laden. And I think prudence calls for us to do our investigation, because then I think we can develop a greater coalition.
Okay, but Brian, look, obviously they're doing the investigation. Otherwise, there'd be some smoke on the horizon someplace already. An investigation is underway. What I am arguing to you is that the United States should not get in a position where it dithers and dawdles and lets the blood run out of this thing. There's a good deal of anger right now, and the country is behind a response. Why wait while we have a bunch of Sherlock Holmes going around and nailing down exact connections everywhere when we know what happened? We know it's bin Laden. You know it's bin Laden.
Wait, no. I have a strong degree of probability that it's bin Laden, but I think you have to recognize that we are part of a world community, and we have to make sure that before we go out and do something, and I agree with you, if we get the persuasive evidence that we all believe is coming in, that we should have a proportionate response. But nevertheless, we also have to recognize that we have allies in the Middle East, we have allies in Europe.
Name one that would argue with our responding today without even asking them. Name one.
I think the Egyptians, I think the Saudi Arabians. But
the
look,
Saudi Arabians, whose riches depend on us, would be angry for us for responding for this destruction of the World Trade Center without asking their permission?
John, you know what? When I was a cop, one of the first things I was taught is don't do the John Wayne reflex syndrome. Don't go out there shooting first and asking questions later. Let's do our homework. We can do the same amount of damage later on and hopefully not hit innocent people and do a proportionate response. Time is on our side. Just because we happen to be riled up now, I don't think represents a prudent response. What I think we have to do is do our homework. And by the way, the longer we wait, the more likely we can get other people who might be involved. I think there is actually a logistical reason for taking a little bit of time to do our homework.
Okay, we were going to do our homework about the coal. We haven't done much about it. We were going to do our homework about the embassy bombings. We dragged some people in, put them on trial. We were going to do our homework about the Beirut Marine barracks bombings, and not much happened there. We were going to do our homework about the Khobar Tower bombings. Not much happened there. How long are we going to do homework, Brian, before we say to the world, we don't need anybody's permission to strike back? We're going to do it.
Well, actually, I think you make a very effective point there. For instance, with the Khobar Tower bombings, I think the cooperation has been less than stellar from the Saudis. That being said, if you're talking, though, about a proportionate response to this particular incident, which is by far the worst act of terrorism, then, yeah, I do think we should wait a little bit and get our homework together. That being said, look, the Taliban still has some time to do the right thing. I wouldn't hold my breath, but we have bin Laden now as an international fugitive with a money reward on his head in the millions. And the Taliban can act on an international arrest warrant now. If they choose not to just for those prior acts, I think we have greater leverage. But let's do our homework. If we take a little bit of time...
We are taking time. We're clearly taking time.
Yeah, but
my argument to you is maybe we shouldn't take too much time.
I agree with you, but by the same token, I don't think that means that within a day or two of this horrendous tragedy happening, that we just shoot from the hip. There are a variety of things that we have to develop diplomatically, militarily. We have to develop certain kinds of intel and relationships and political dealings with our allies, and it's important to do your homework. It's one thing for people like us who are doing stuff in the media or in academia to say things. It's another thing to carry out the logistics.
Brian, in your expertise, this is clearly a terror success. Do the people who have the desire to commit this kind of terrorism say, bingo, we did it, let's all stand down and take a nice vacation and be happy that we did such a great job? Or is this going to inspire them to do more and do more quicker rather than later?
I think for the short term, you might very well see a stand down just because the bar is so high now. You know, people are so vigilant now. There are no planes in the air. Like I said, I just drove from San Francisco. Targets now are much more hardened than they were 3 days ago, so you might have a stand down just because it's more difficult. But long term, each of these successes and also the failures breed additional acts. That being said, though, we have 41,000 people dying in highway accidents. And this is a tragedy, but it's something that took months, maybe over a year to plan for.
Brian Levin, I'm going to end this right now and ask you to just sit there and listen, because Brian Levin of the Cal State University, San Bernardino, a terrorism expert, we have on the phone now with us our Fox News correspondent Greg Palkot, who is in Pakistan. And Greg, I know that there is, it's been described earlier as a love-hate relationship between Pakistan and Osama bin Laden. What is the word around where you are about what the United States should or will do?
John, certainly there is a lot of nervousness here, a lot of looking over to Washington to try to figure out what is next. Seared in the minds of everybody here in Islamabad, Pakistan is, of course, the retaliatory raids conducted by the United States against Afghanistan, against the establishments, the training bases of Osama bin Laden in Afghanistan, following the U.S. embassy hits in East Africa. A lot of concern about that. What we're seeing now in tangible ways is international workers being evacuated from Afghanistan. UN taking out 80 members of their staff throughout Afghanistan, NGOs also pulling out of Afghanistan, other workers involved with the trial of the U.S. and other missionaries that have been going on in Kabul. So certainly there is the feeling among the international community here that something could be happening soon. They want to get their staffers out of there because if missiles, if bombs start flying in Afghanistan, certainly the foreigners, the international workers, would be certainly the first ones targeted. Here in Pakistan, you're right, John. It is a love-hate relationship. That's what concerns the United States to a large extent. Pakistan, of course, its president saying that they are cooperating with the United States. They want to support their efforts to end terrorism and also to particularly deal with these attacks. But over the years, they have been a very, very large supporter of the Taliban regime. They have supplied them with money, with arms, with manpower. So if you take that one step further, John, we're looking at at least in a backdoor way, the Pakistan government helping to some degree Osama bin Laden, who is being hosted by the Taliban regime. There's been pressure being put here. The new U.S. ambassador designate here is meeting today with the president to impress on him that the United States expects 100% help here to try to resolve the situation. In Afghanistan itself, however, again, the Taliban regime is saying no, there is no involvement by the regime or by Osama bin Laden, that it is not possible for Osama bin Laden to have been involved in these attacks, that they have kept him away from any kind of communication with the outside world. In fact, we were just getting reports in the past hour or so that the Taliban regime claims that they have Osama bin Laden under house arrest. They're also saying that, in fact, they would hand him over in an extradition process if the evidence was provided. But this is what, John, the Taliban has been saying for a long time here. They've been saying that basically they have him under watch, that he is being monitored, that, in fact, they would be happy to hand him over if they only had the evidence. But their standards for that evidence is very, very high. And the United States, of course, is taking everything with a very large grain of salt, John.
Greg, aside from Afghanistan and the regime of the Taliban, who would certainly be number one on the list of suspects, what other countries in the region might have good reason to be nervous about U.S. retaliatory strikes? Well, of course, we're talking about Osama bin Laden. He is a Saudi exile. He is in Afghanistan, but his network, the Al-Qaeda, that is translated as the base. It is an organization with tentacles stretching far, far from here and in various countries throughout the Mideast and beyond. There are members of this group and in different subgroups in Saudi Arabia, in Yemen, in Egypt, in Algeria, in Tunisia. And all of these groups are under the larger umbrella of this Al-Qaeda group. So if we're talking about retaliatory strikes, if we're talking about the United States, and in fact this is exactly what the Secretary of State Colin Powell has said, that it is not just one retaliatory strike that they're talking about an ongoing war. We're talking about something that might be taking out more than one individual, one base here in nearby Afghanistan, but trying to rout out those individuals throughout. Greg, let me interrupt you because I just want to read something to you. The Washington Post reporting tomorrow that Afghanistan's ruling Taliban militia has actually moved its top leader, Mohammed Omar, out of his headquarters and into hiding, anticipating a U.S. attack, and is repositioning its military hardware throughout the country, according to press reports today received where you are, by Pakistani intelligence sources. And the quotes go more or less like this: definite reports that the Taliban are now preparing to meet a major U.S. military onslaught. It's a warlike situation inside the Taliban military installations inside Afghanistan. So I take it that that's the sort of information that you are also hearing in Islamabad.
Yeah. In fact, John, the targets are pretty straightforward. United States intelligence knows about what are spoken of as dozens of bases that the U.S. feels are used inside Afghanistan to train terrorists of various nationalities to go out and do damage. and we're talking about including in the United States, of course, these terror bases would be easily identified and easily targeted by the United States. But also, as you
Greg,
noted,
let me interrupt you in that thought. We have to take a quick pause to let our some Fox stations leave us for their local news, but we will continue. Greg Palcott's on the phone. Let's take that pause. We are back now. Once again, just for those who are joining us or need to be refreshed, Greg Palcott talking to us from Islamabad, Pakistan, about what is going on inside Afghanistan as the Taliban regime braces for a U.S. attack of some sort. Greg, I'm sorry to have interrupted you.
John, in addition to the terror bases, which have been long identified by the United States intelligence, there are clearly the military installations of the Taliban regime, as well as the government offices and government facilities. One would think, although we're not privy to what's going on right now in the White House, the Pentagon, etc., one would think that one way to deal with the Taliban regime would be to say something like this: unless you start giving up Osama bin Laden and others of his ilk that are being hosted in your country, we will very easily start taking out the bits and pieces of your own government infrastructure. And that kind of a threat, that kind of a looming possibility, obviously is sinking into the minds of the Taliban leadership. As you mentioned in reports, we have Omar, the leader, the religious leader of the Taliban regime, according to these reports, moving from his base in Kandahar, that's in the southern part of Afghanistan. That's going to be the problem, John, actually, with targeting any of these folks, however, the individuals, the people. We might be hitting buildings, we might be hitting bases. These bases often are nothing more than a few huts in a dirt field, but getting to the people might be more difficult. According to the individuals that are close to Osama bin Laden, they can pick up and move camp within a half an hour.
Greg
they can head off into the mountains there of Afghanistan. They are very mobile, John.
Greg Palcott, our Fox News correspondent overseas right now in Islamabad, Pakistan, right on the border of Afghanistan. Greg has been inside Afghanistan and talked to the Taliban leaders in recent months, and he is on the scene for us now. Greg, thanks very much. At this hour, officials in New York City are worried 3 additional buildings could collapse in the area where the World Trade Center towers used to stand. This new danger only complicates what has been one of the most difficult search and rescue efforts in history. John Scott reports.
The fire raged high in Tower 1. Smoke boiled into the air, and the rescue effort was on. Volunteer firefighter Michael Maraglio was among the first to arrive.
What we had to do is we had to battle our way into the Trade Center. But first, to put out fires of the vehicles that were on fire. We put out maybe 3-4 dozen cars before we were able to get in to the actual center of it all. And that took over 2 hours just to put the fires out of the cars.
Smoke and debris made any rescue nearly impossible.
You couldn't see, but you could hear. You could hear the steel bending. You could hear the crumbling. You could hear people's voices. There was nothing you could do. There was not a thing you could do for them.
Then a flash of hope.
We do know there are people in the building that are alive. We know that for a fact.
From somewhere in the rubble, at least one person called for help from a cell phone. Then, New York Mayor Rudolph Giuliani announced that one of New York's bravest had been pulled alive from the ruins of the World Trade Center.
And I had one patient, we grabbed her, put her in the ambulance. She was full of soot. She was covered from head to toe with ashes.
Most of those injured were taken immediately to New York hospitals, with injuries ranging from burns to abrasions on corneas from flying debris. Many of the rescue workers themselves were brought in, treated for exhaustion and shock.
Our job was to make sure that the firemen and the cops had food and water, got their eyes cleaned, got a place to lay down.
At the Pentagon, rescue workers spent the night trying to shore up the building. The fire still burns, and a spokesman has said that is hampering the rescue effort.
And then, just as workers began to make progress in the rescue effort, came a new danger, a gas leak, forcing the evacuation of the World Trade Center rescue site.
The desperate attempts to find survivors in both locations will no doubt go on for days, possibly weeks. But as time passes, hope dwindles. In New York, John Scott, Fox News.
Digging. That is what they're doing now in New York City. It is unfortunately too early to know how many people have died at this point, but as the mayor put it, it's too many to bear. A handful have been pulled out alive, and that gives the rescuers at least some hope as they work around the clock.
Meanwhile, planes remain grounded all over the United States of America. Airports are closed. People are stranded. And the question is, when will the airlines be allowed to get back to business? And when they do, how will air travel change in this country?
And now there's word the hijackers who carried out Tuesday's suicide missions got their training right here in the United States. They went to flight schools in Florida. There's news about that. We'll have it for you. And also news of 5 people being detained.
Good evening, everybody, or good morning, rather. This is Fox's continuous coverage of America's nightmare in New York City and in Washington, D.C. I'm Lori Dew.
And I'm Rick Fulbaum.
Obviously, it is day 2 of what has been absolutely a national and international disaster. There is evidence the death toll in the World Trade Center attacks could be in the thousands, as New York City Mayor Rudy Giuliani said earlier today. That is where our team coverage begins, near Ground Zero in New York City with our own David Lee Miller.
Lori, it's a little after 1 in the morning here on the East Coast, on the lower Manhattan, and rescue workers are still very much on the scene, and they're going to remain on the scene. There is still a great deal of work here to do. As for statistics, we do not have a precise number now of the expected fatalities, but as you mentioned, it is expected to be well into the thousands. Mayor Giuliani, in fact, has requested of the federal government that they provide to the city 6,000 body bags, that to supplement the supply of body bags that are now on hand. As for survivors, as you mentioned again, this is almost day 2 since the tragedy. We have reports now that there are only 9 survivors that the authorities have been able to locate under the rubble. One story especially miraculous, the story of John McLaughlin. He is a Port Authority police officer. He was on the 82nd floor of one of the towers when suddenly the building began to give way. He literally rode the debris all the way to the ground. His injuries, only broken legs and fractured ankles. Now, earlier we had some very tense moments. About 5:30 this evening, rescue workers, police, and vehicles were racing down Church Street away from the site of the World Trade Center. There was concern that a number of buildings here could collapse, buildings that were seriously damaged and suffered structural damage after the blast of the Twin Towers. Some of the eyewitnesses says windows began to pop out and cracks began to appear in the structures. We were broadcasting live a few blocks closer to the towers. Suddenly, in the midst of our broadcast, the police unplugged our microphones and cameras, told us to move. It was too dangerous, and we relocated to the position we're in now. We have since learned that for the most part that appears to have been a false alarm. Those buildings, at least for now, are considered safe enough for the rescue workers to have returned to the scene. And here's what's going on right now at the scene. They are digging. They are digging into the wreckage. They are using special welding equipment to cut into the steel frame of the Twin Towers. Once they do that with their hands, they are actually taking the debris, worker to worker, placing it in special trucks, dump trucks, that then move up Church Street here all the way to Midtown Manhattan and to a location in New Jersey. The FBI is also examining the debris. What they're looking for, of course, any evidence, in particular the black boxes that belong to the 2 jetliners that smashed into the towers. Now, as you might expect, the relatives and friends of the victims here still very much in shock and anguish, still searching for news. We talked to one woman a few hours ago. She identified herself as a high school teacher. We saw her wiping the white ash off of a car here in Lower Manhattan. We asked her, "Is this your car?" And she told us, "No, these are my friends." Back to you.
All right, David Lee Miller in Lower Manhattan. David, thanks so much. The fire at the Pentagon, meantime, is finally out. And just like in New York, rescue workers are getting ready to go through the rubble. And unfortunately, they'll have to remove some bodies there.
Fox's Brian Wilson has been there all evening, and he joins us there again from the Pentagon with the latest. Good evening, Brian.
Hello, Lori. Hello, Rick. Yes, the work continues around the clock here at the Pentagon. You know, we're not having the death toll numbers that you're going to see in New York. Still a grim task at hand. But let's talk about something that was rather patriotic and inspiring. It happened late this afternoon. Workers who have been digging through the rubble here at the Pentagon climbed to the top of the building and unfurled a giant American flag alongside the Pentagon. It is a huge flag. You can see it perhaps over my shoulder a moment ago. This was about maybe 50, 60 yards from the impact crater site. And this all happened as, a matter of fact, the President of the United States was here. The President left the White House. He came over to the Pentagon and spent about an hour, we are told, where he visited with the folks who have been working around the clock to try to clean up this mess, to try to bring this situation under control. Now, the cleanup. It is not a pretty sight at the scene. We now believe the death toll to stand at about 80. That number is expected to climb. But we must also tell you that the number that we were bandying about yesterday as perhaps going as high as 800 people, that's probably going to be a bit higher than a reality. We are being told now that 100, 150 people are unaccounted for. We can't get precise numbers. Nobody is saying that's all we're going to get. But they certainly are saying that the number 800 would be an absolute disastrous worst-case scenario, and they don't expect it actually to climb that high. So we are waiting to learn exactly what they can do here. They do not believe there are any survivors. They have to begin going through the rubble, but there is great concern about the stability of the crash site. They don't want to put the rescue workers at risk, given the fact that they actually don't believe there is anyone there to be rescued. I'm Brian Wilson at the Pentagon. Back to you, Lori, Rick.
Brian, of course, the scene is also a crime scene. What is being done to preserve whatever evidence might be available there? Brian Wilson? I believe we've lost Brian Wilson, but we'll be checking back with him throughout the night. We're going to move on now to some other news and investigators who say that they know the identities of more than a dozen men who hijacked the 4 planes. The suspects leaving a trail up and down the East Coast.
Fox's Todd Connor has been following the story for us tonight. He joins us now from Fox Central. Hi, Todd. What can you tell us about this?
Hi, Rick and Lori. Well, the FBI believes anywhere from 3 to 6 hijackers were on each of the 4 planes that were taken over on Tuesday, and they're looking for others who may have helped these hijackers kill the thousands of innocent Americans. The FBI believes they may find some of their answers in Boston. On Wednesday, agents with shields, bulletproof vests, stormed Boston's Westin Hotel. 3 people were taken into custody, but then those 3 people were later released. As we all know, 2 of the flying bombs that struck the World Trade Center came out of Boston's Logan International Airport, an airport which is now beefing up security. Tow trucks busy moving 2,000 cars from a parking garage there, where authorities found a rental car possibly left behind by the hijackers. They confirmed it contained Arabic language flight training manuals, and the Boston Globe reports it had an instruction video on flying commercial airlines and a fuel consumption calculator. Meanwhile, 400 FBI agents in Florida are checking at a few flight training schools, including Embry-Riddle Flight Training School, trying to determine if the killer pilots got their training there.
We are cooperating with the FBI and other law enforcement officials. We are quickly responding to each and every request.
All right, a former employee at another flight training school in Venice, Florida, says FBI agents told him that the car that was found at Logan International Airport was connected to 2 former students at that school. Meanwhile, Fox News has learned that 2 weeks ago, several months ago, let me clarify that, several months ago, an American Airlines crew had their hotel rooms broken into when they're in Rome, Italy. Stolen were their pilots' uniforms and their IDs. And now, 2 weeks ago, American sent out a memo to its employees to be on the lookout for, quote, imposter pilots. So, is that how these hijackers got aboard, by posing as pilots? That could be the case possibly for the American flights, but there were 2 United flights as well that crashed. So these are the latest details coming to us now. Back to you, Lori and Rick.
All right, Todd Connor reporting from Fox Central. Thanks very much.
Now, United Flight 93 is the plane that crashed into Pennsylvania, and there is word that some of the passengers on that plane may have taken on the hijackers before that plane went down. They might have even known about the events that had taken place earlier in the morning at the World Trade Center. One of the victims actually called his wife on his cell phone, told her that they were being attacked.
Then she told him what had happened at the World Trade Centers. He called her back later to say he and some of the other passengers were planning to act. Now, they may have acted against the hijackers, but of course, we may never know for sure. He was not the only passenger who made a last-minute call.
As terrorists took over 4 flights Tuesday, passengers and crew members used cell phones to reach out with urgent cries for help, with information for authorities, or with last-second words of love for family members. Mark Bingham was aboard United Flight 93, which had left Newark for San Francisco. He reached family members at home.
He just said, I want to let you all know that I love you very, very much in case I don't see you again.
I said that.
That the plane has been taken over by hijackers. And then I said, well, we love you very much too, Mark. Let me go get your mother.
An unidentified man hiding in a bathroom aboard Flight 93 dialed 911 on his cell phone to reach a dispatcher outside Pittsburgh. We are being hijacked. We are being hijacked. This is not a joke, he said, before his phone went dead. Aboard the same flight, Lauren Grancolis, on her way home to San Francisco from her grandmother's funeral in New Jersey, was able to reach her husband, Jack. We have been hijacked, she told him. They are being kind. I love you. Flight attendant C.C. Ross of Fort Myers, Florida, put through a panicked call to her husband, Lauren Lyles, who had just gotten their 2 sons off to school. He heard screams in the background as she told him, we've been hijacked. I love you. I love the children. Still on Flight 93, Thomas Burnett called his wife Dina and told her of a final act of resistance to terror. I know we're all going to die. There's 3 of us who are going to do something about it, he said. Flight 93 was the only plane that didn't reach its target, crashing into an empty field in southern Pennsylvania. Peter Hansen of Groton, Massachusetts, was aboard United Flight 175 with his wife and their 3-year-old daughter as it left Boston for Los Angeles. He reached his father in Connecticut. Hansen told his parents he knew they were all going to die, but he tried to reassure them. Don't worry about us. It's going to be quick, Hansen told his father. United Flight 175 was the second plane to crash into the World Trade Center. Fox News commentator Barbara Olson was aboard American Airlines Flight 77 as it left Washington for Los Angeles. She was able to place 2 calls to her husband, Theodore Olson, the U.S. Solicitor General. Our plane is being hijacked. She then asked, what should I tell the pilot? The call was cut off, but she immediately called back to ask again, what should I tell the pilot? Those were her final words as minutes later, American Flight 77 became a massive missile and crashed into the Pentagon. Steve Brown, Fox News.
President Bush working with Congress on legislation authorizing military retaliation. He is vowing to spend, quote, whatever it takes.
Joining us now to analyze the political implications of any kind of retaliation is Jim Pinkerton. He is a columnist with Newsday and a Fox News contributor. Good evening, Jim. It's good to see you. Thanks so much for coming in.
Thank you.
Well, we have a little bit of breaking news to report. The House has just passed Resolution 4080, voting on terrorist attack. What do you know about this? And it's really no surprise that they would pass this, is it, Jim?
No, and I think it's actually sort of not even a formality. It's a little unnecessary. I mean, plenty of presidents, including President Clinton, including President Bush, this President Bush, have ordered strikes when they thought it was necessary. Obviously, this strengthens the president's hand in terms of diplomacy and military action, but it just shows, I guess, just how united the country is right now.
So really, it was just kind of a formality more than anything?
I think so. I mean, clearly, a lot's going to change. I mean, the number of $20 billion of special appropriations to deal with damage and counterterrorism is being thrown around. I can see easily how they could spend $20 billion just on awards to families and so on. But I was just sitting here listening and making a list of things in terms of domestic issues, in terms of, I mean, foreign policy aside. I mean, we will go after Osama bin Laden if he's the guilty person, and my hunch would be that, he'll be dead or in prison within the year, just because he's so hot. I mean, even the Taliban seems to think that he's a little too much for them to keep around right now. And again, not only was it valuable for the U.S. Congress to do what it did today or yesterday, but also the NATO to join in like that. And it's clear that this has been such a despicable and outrageous act that all the civilized nations of the world are going to join in.
So the president is getting support, obviously, here at home. He has said he wants $20 billion, vowing to spend whatever it takes. We're hearing that the NATO nations say, if you attack one of us, you attack all of us, which is really what America needs to hear right now, isn't it?
That's right. And I mean, President Bush, not unlike his father, has been, I think, good about getting on the phone with foreign leaders. And all day we've been hearing, President Chirac of France called and President Putin of Russia called, I think, twice. So that's very reassuring. But obviously, there's a lot. The problem we're going to have is that the essence of all this terrorism is not a terrorist strike that requires a massive logistical infrastructure of like an army. This is, according to your report, 12 or maybe 24, nuttily, crazily kamikaze people who obviously had a lot of planning and premeditation, but they weren't taking off from a base someplace. They would just, quit their jobs as cab drivers or whatever, and then got on an airplane and killed 10,000 people. So the problem we're really going to have is what we do here at home about issues like air traffic control. I mean, it is amazing to me that in the most densely traveled air corridors, including over Manhattan and also over Washington with all the sensitive facilities here, that they could be flying around airplanes off course, sort of almost seemingly in erratic directions, and nobody seemed to notice, and that they could even crash an airplane into the headquarters of the U.S. military. I mean, if that doesn't...
Hi, Jim. It's Rick Fulbaum. Good morning.
Right.
So you're talking about what's going to happen here domestically. What about flights that are still grounded? We heard from the Secretary of Transportation today. He said he doesn't have a date. He can't tell us exactly when civil aviation is going to get back online and the airline business is going to get back to normal, or at least get back to business. I mean, when would it be appropriate for airports to start opening up again and people to start getting on airplanes again?
It would be appropriate when they have the sort of security that would make people feel safe. If you've ever flown El Al, the Israeli airline, they take you into a little room and just ask you questions and kind of frisk you if they feel like it. And they don't have much problem with this sort of hijacking and so on. And we do. All these, again, Fox News has been reporting, FAA investigators were able to infiltrate, what was it, 68% of the time a couple of years ago. And again, it's amazing that those kind of statistics came into existence and nobody did anything about them. That won't happen again. I suspect that Transportation Secretary Mineta is going to say, look, I'm not going to allow this to happen while I'm Transportation Secretary, and we'll just take our time until we bring in enough security guards and analysts and so on to get to the bottom of this. So it's going to make air travel a slow but hopefully safer process probably forever now.
But Jim, you're talking about El Al and you're talking about Israel, where there is a totally different kind of mentality amongst the government and amongst the people. We are Americans and we are not used to this kind of thing. I mean, how long is it going to take for people, not just in New York City and in Washington, D.C., where people have been hit hardest by these attacks, but people in the middle of the country to begin to understand that there are going to be serious changes taking place when it comes time for them to get onto an airplane?
Well, I think nothing like watching these photographs, and I suspect every American has seen these pictures, these horrible, grim pictures now for a couple hundred times in the last 36 hours or so. So, I mean, it's clearly going to be a cultural change. You're going to see a lot of these issues that became extremely argumentative here in Washington, like, for example, surveillance of the internet, surveillance of telephones, the so-called echelon system that allegedly monitors transatlantic phone calls, this thing they call carnivore. which keeps track of the FBI had to keep track of the internet. These have been incredibly controversial, and the government has sort of backed off on a lot of these security measures. I suspect, again, the polls I was seeing earlier tonight on Fox of, 86% think we're at war and so on. Those are the kind of numbers that will justify significant changes in some of these domestic issues. Again, I come back to immigration as one. As we identify who these people are and we figure out, when they came here, not to say that there's anything wrong with immigrants per se, but just the reality that if these people came here recently and killed a bunch of Americans, we can't have that. That'll change too.
Jim, final question. We've only got about 30 seconds left. At some point, the hurt that everybody's feeling is going to give way to anger, and I think it already is. The American people are going to at some point say, hey, whoever did this, Osama bin Laden or whoever, let's get him good, right?
I think that'll probably happen. I think but the issue will be the next terrorist after him. That's the thing we have to concentrate on as policymakers.
All right, Jim Pinkerton with Newsday and a Fox News contributor. Thanks for coming in tonight. We really do appreciate it.
Thanks, Jim. A few trigger-happy gas stations around the country are now quietly lowering their prices after panicking and jacking up the prices on Tuesday.
That's right. We saw some gouging going on yesterday, and it wasn't just the gas station owners. Plenty of folks topped off their tanks, whether they needed to or not. Alicia Acuna has the story.
Temporary price hikes generated by fears that the terrorist attacks on the United States may prompt a surge in gas prices sent anxious Americans out in droves on Tuesday to fill up their tanks.
I heard Wichita is $4.50, Blue Springs is $4.
In Southeast, I've heard it's $6 a gallon, so I can't even think about that.
Well, I heard it was going up to $7 a gallon in Texas.
Although some gas stations argued their price increases were the result of supply and demand, this was the exception rather than the rule. Oil and gas analysts say there are no indications that the price of oil is going up due to the attacks on the East Coast.
Anybody who thinks that they can go out and raise the price and have it hold for very long is kidding themselves, in addition to being unpatriotic.
Under threat of prosecution, gas stations that were gouging customers quickly dropped their prices back to normal. What's more, OPEC released a statement assuring consumers that all member countries remain committed to continuing their policy of strengthening market stability. Further reassurance came from the nation's largest oil company, ExxonMobil, asking all its customers to maintain their normal buying habits as they are trying to avoid an artificial shortage. Industry officials say an artificial shortage would come about if everyone ran out and filled their tanks at the same time. This would drain supplies, and then prices would go up. In Denver, Alicia Acuna, Fox News.
So the effects of Tuesday's terror attacks affecting world financial markets.
The overseas markets will be open today, but the U.S. stock market is going to be closed until at least Friday, probably even Monday. Joining us now with a look at the economic fallout from this attack, we are joined by our senior business correspondent, Brenda Butner. Hi, Brenda.
Thanks so much. Well, the last few days have felt like a year, haven't they?
They sure have.
And in fact, it's only been since last Monday that we last heard the opening bell. And it looks like the opening bell is going to ring again, perhaps on Friday, most likely on Monday. This is the longest time that we have ever gone without stock trading, unscheduled stock trading, since the Great Depression, so it's been quite some time. And Wall Street officials are quite anxious to get that opening bell ringing again because they see it as a symbol of defiance against terrorism. The chairman of the New York Stock Exchange said it quite well when he said they can attack infrastructure, but they cannot attack ideals. They can take down buildings, but they cannot take down a fair, free market. So there may be some glitches. There is huge infrastructure that's involved in the area, which is essentially a war zone in South Manhattan. But everyone is very anxious to get it going. Tomorrow, the bond market actually opens, and it's expected that we may see some buying in bonds. There's usually a flight to quality, is what it's called, a flight to more safe instruments other than stocks. So we'll be looking for that. But the overseas markets have been amazingly stable tonight, except with the exception of Thailand, Malaysia, and Taiwan, which did not open last night. So everybody took a big shock last night, and now they're stabilizing, as are the currency markets. So everybody's waiting, hopefully, to see what will happen in the U.S. market.
So many of the companies, Brenda, that are traded on the stock exchange were based in the World Trade Center towers. I'm just wondering about the psyche of the people who do business down on Wall Street and how they'll be able to get themselves psychologically prepared to get back in there and get back to business.
Well, it's not only psychologically, it's actually physically getting the people back into the NYSE, which is literally was in the shadow of the World Trade Center and is an icon of Wall Street itself, so that there was great concern that it itself might be a target. But yes, psychologically, this is very, very difficult, and many of the people whom I interview on a regular basis are still unaccounted for. It's very difficult for all of us, you know, the thousands of people who are yet unaccounted for. Very, very difficult for the entire community.
I know I've got some friends who work at Morgan Stanley, and I know a lot of businesses like Morgan Stanley, other businesses are based in the World Trade Center. Some are being accounted for. There's going to be a lot of loss of life and a lot of loss of paper.
Yes.
Sheer paperwork. And we're talking about billions of dollars here, and just so much that's going to be lost.
Yes, records, computer files. We have yet to see, I think, exactly what will happen when that opening bell rings. We will have to see, you know, how many glitches there actually are. But I think, again, officials are quite anxious to get it going. We're trying to get back to business as usual as a slap, basically, to the terrorists who tried to take it out.
Saying they can't stop us, they can't stop our markets.
Absolutely.
All right, senior correspondent Brenda Butner, it's great to have you staying up late with us tonight.
Absolutely, thank you.
Thanks, Brenda. President Bush says the attacks against America, not just acts of terrorism, he says they were acts of war.
He says the U.S. is ready to face its enemy.
Just completed a meeting with our national security team, and we've received the latest intelligence updates. The deliberate and deadly attacks which were carried out yesterday against our country were more than acts of terror. They were acts of war. This will require our country to unite in steadfast determination and resolve. Freedom and democracy are under attack. The American people need to know we're facing a different enemy than we have ever faced. This enemy hides in shadows and has no regard for human life. This is an enemy who preys on innocent and unsuspecting people, then runs for cover. But it won't be able to run for cover forever. This is an enemy that tries to hide, but it won't be able to hide forever. This is an enemy that thinks its harbors are safe, but they won't be safe forever. This enemy attacked not just our people, but all freedom-loving people everywhere in the world. The United States of America will use all our resources to conquer this enemy. We will rally the world. We will be patient, we'll be focused, and we will be steadfast in our determination. This battle will take time and resolve, but make no mistake about it, we will win. The federal government and all our agencies are conducting business, but it is not business as usual. We are operating on heightened security alert. America is going forward, and as we do so, we must remain keenly aware of the threats to our country. Those in authority should take appropriate precautions to protect our citizens. But we will not allow this enemy to win the war by changing our way of life or restricting our freedoms. This morning I am sending to Congress a request for emergency funding authority so that we are prepared to spend whatever it takes to rescue victims, to help the citizens of New York City and Washington, D.C. respond to this tragedy, and to protect our national security. I want to thank the members of Congress for their unity and support. America is united. The freedom-loving nations of the world stand by our side. This will be a monumental struggle of good versus evil, but good will prevail. Thank you very much.
And we want to take you now back down to Lower Manhattan, where rescue workers continue to dig at the site where the World Trade Center towers once stood. David Lee Miller is joining us. He has been, and he continues to join us from downtown where that search is taking place. Hi, David.
Hi there, Rick. A very difficult situation was made even more tense a few hours ago when the southerly tower, parts of that, further collapsed. Also, there were reports that two other buildings adjacent to the World Trade Towers were going to give way. Some of the workers there said the windows began to pop out. They noticed cracks in the structure that had been weakened. And suddenly we found that workers, emergency crews equipment was being brought down Church Street, which is now where we are located, away from the site. For a while, some of the workers began to run in the opposite direction from the area where the towers once stood. In fact, we were live on the air. Police pulled the plug literally on our cameras and microphones and relocated us to this location where they thought it would be much safer. We have since learned now that for the most part that was a false alarm. The buildings they thought were teetering that could give way show no signs of doing that, at least in the near future, and most of the workers have returned to the scene. The rescue operation is now continuing. They do, however, face a very difficult and gruesome task. In fact, earlier we talked to a volunteer doctor who has been here. He, in fact, treated 4 of the survivors, and he said that the scene about 10 blocks from where I am now located looks a lot worse than what you see on television.
I think it does a disservice to the American people not to have media access right at the scene, as long as it's secure and it doesn't jeopardize any national security, because what you see from far away, the shots that I'm seeing, it does not describe the horrific nature of the trauma, both physically, in terms of life, in terms of psychological trauma, of all the rescue workers, the victims. You have to be up close. It looks like a volcano went off, not a bomb. There's ash knee deep. It's the craziest thing you've ever seen, and the American public needs to see it. They need to see what has been done to this country.
I'm not sure that many Americans would like to see, if given the chance, all that devastation up close and personal. It is, according to those we have talked with, very, very disturbing. If this helps put it in perspective, the mayor of the city of New York, Rudy Giuliani, is asking federal officials now for 6,000 body bags, and that's to supplement the ones that the city already has. And further complicating things, we are now getting reports that there are asbestos particles in the air caused by the blast of the Twin Towers, and for that reason we are wearing these masks, as are the rescue workers, all the time, because they say there is a serious health risk. Back to you in the studio.
All right, David, put your mask on. Thanks for the report. We'll check back with you. More than 200 people remain unaccounted for at the Pentagon. Rescue crews there are hoping to have enough demolition work done by daybreak to enter into that impact area.
Fox's David Schuster is live at the Pentagon with the latest. And David, what is concerning everybody the most right now at the Pentagon?
Well, Lori, the greatest concern is simply the structure on the south side of the Pentagon where that American Airlines jetliner crashed into it. It has been very unstable. It's been described as leaning at a 45-degree angle, some of the walls and beams. And until they can really strengthen that part of the building, it is very unsafe, according to fire and rescue crews, for them to go very far. The good news, though, is that it's been a totally different scene this evening than it was just 12 hours ago. The fires are completely out. There's not that same sort of odor or stench in the air of the burning flames and the burning debris. Furthermore, for the first time now, a lot of the lights are on the north side of the Pentagon, something that was completely dark last night, and you are actually seeing the parking lots filling up with people. So clearly people are back to work at the Pentagon, at least in those areas that were unaffected by either the explosion or the flames or the dumping of hundreds of gallons of water a minute to try to control those flames earlier today. But again, workers describe the structure as being very unstable. Despite that, they have managed to recover some 80 bodies. There were reports from Arlington fire crews about 15 hours ago that the death toll might rise to as high as 800 because of the number of people that worked on the south side of the Pentagon where the jetliner went in. But since then, everybody at the Pentagon, including the Secretary of Defense, has tried to dismiss some of those claims. The Secretary of Defense, Donald Rumsfeld, had a news conference earlier today. Here's part of what he had to say.
We currently believe and are certainly hopeful that the number of casualties being reported in the press is high. As you know from your own observation out there, the work is still going forward, and we won't know for some time precise numbers, but from everything that we currently know, the estimate that's been widely reported is considerably high.
And particularly the one from Pennsylvania, there's a lot of discussion about the alternate target. I think if they did survive, and they certainly should be locatable in Pennsylvania, they ought to provide, they may provide some clues. Now, the other thing, these guys were significant enough or sophisticated enough to shut down the transponders, so they may have been sophisticated enough to pull the so-called circuit breaker that controls the cockpit voice recorder. If they did that, the boxes will be useless. But if not, they could provide some important clues on the targeting. We've all heard rumors that perhaps the Pentagon was not the initial target for the Washington-bound aircraft. And again, if they recover the cockpit voice recording box from the Pentagon, perhaps we'll hear a discussion as to just what that target initially was.
But there's no guarantee, is there?
Absolutely not. And as I said, if they did pull the circuit breaker or shut down, you can shut these boxes down in flight. If they were sophisticated enough to shut down other pieces of electronics, maybe they knew enough to shut this down, and that'll be unfortunate if that happened.
Well, maybe luck will be on everybody's side in this case.
Let's hope so, Laurie.
All right, Alan Deal, former NTSB investigator and FAA scientist, thanks very much for taking the time to talk with us.
You're certainly welcome.
Well, as you just heard Dr. Deal say, as investigators search through the rubble in New York City and in Pennsylvania, one of their goals is to find that cockpit voice and data recorder.
These so-called black boxes, which we talked about a moment ago, they could hold the key to a lot of unanswered questions.
So what exactly are they, and why are they so valuable?
The so-called black boxes are actually fluorescent orange, and by airline regulations, nothing else can be this color on any commercial aircraft. There are usually 2 boxes on each flight. Investigators consider both to be essential because one records cockpit conversations and sounds, the other records technical data.
The flight recorder is very good at telling us what's wrong with the airplane, things that are actually, the engine quit, landing gear didn't come down, something like that. Something that actually has to do with the airplane. That's the flight recorder's strong point. The voice recorder is very good at this operational, the man-machine interface, the crew, and how they interact with the airplane and decisions that they make.
The recorders are usually located in the back of a jet. That's because the most predictable point of impact in a crash is towards the front. Still, the boxes are made to withstand forces 10 times greater than a crash and temperatures higher than those caused by burning fuel.
Most of the cockpit voice recorders and flight recorders that we get look just like this. They look probably as good as the day they were made, maybe a few scratches and a few dents. Every once in a while we will get a recorder that has been smashed.
If it has been smashed in water, that is usually not a problem. Recorders retrieved from the ocean are kept in ocean water until investigators examine them.
It's the air that hurts the tape once it's been wet. It actually will start to rust. So we have them shipped here in water, and then as soon as we're ready to play them, we take them out of the water, dry them off, and then get a good copy of it before anything starts to deteriorate. We have had recorders underwater for upwards of 6 and 7 years, and they're just fine.
The flight data recorder, which tracks the technical and mechanical information, comes in 2 different formats. The first is a tape-based recorder, which gathers data on a 30-minute loop. The second format records data on computer chips and can compile more than 25 hours worth of flight information. It all comes out as numbers, calculations, or technical words and bits.
It's actually a waveform that is then, it's zeros and ones that our software decodes into numbers, and then we can bring it up on the screen and see altitude and airspeed and different flight control positions and pitch and roll and what the aircraft is actually doing. It looks like a strip chart with the lines moving across the screen.
At this station, flight data recorder specialist Cassandra Johnson examines a tape-based recorder. She has downloaded the data, and her computer software has made the conversions.
We're reading it out, we're getting good data, we have a graph of the incident or accident, and we will pass it along to the investigator so that they can see what the recorder is telling them about the aircraft. And the most important part is for them to focus on a certain systems.
What the recorder is telling them is not always easy to picture, so the safety board sometimes generates a data-based animation to help explain what happened. This one is from a 1999 American Airlines crash. An MD-82 was coming into land at the airport in Little Rock, Arkansas.
It was almost midnight, as you can see by the time up here. There were storms in the area, and the aircraft landed on the runway, proceeded to skid around on the runway, and then went off the end of the runway down an embankment, impacted a steel structure, and 11 people, including the pilot, were killed.
In that particular crash, investigators were also helped by the cockpit voice recorder. It revealed the pilots knew about the storms but thought they had a clear path down the runway.
And approach American 1420, I know you're doing your best, but we're getting pretty close to the storm. We'll keep it tight as we have to.
Cockpit voice recorders give investigators a good idea of what the crew was doing when the incident happened. It can also paint a personal picture of despair and confusion.
Sometimes the crew doesn't have any idea what's going wrong. They don't have any more idea than we do what's going wrong with the airplane. They may say things that are just completely not right because from the information that they have, that's their analysis of that information, and it's very difficult sometimes to do that on the fly when things are really going badly.
Vern Ellingstad is director of the Office of Research and Engineering at the NTSB. He says the safety board learned something new from every incident or crash.
Aviation accidents are a very rare event. It's a very safe form of transportation, and the predictability of what might go wrong in each of these kind of rare circumstances is very difficult. So we do, recover a huge amount of important information.
Some safety experts believe it is not enough, and already the NTSB is considering whether recorders should have their own power supplies. In the crash of a Swiss Air jet, the last 6 minutes were not on the data recorder because of an electrical problem in the plane. The safety board is also thinking about placing video cameras in the cockpit. Still, investigators believe that nothing provides as much information as the so-called black boxes. They are the key, say the experts, to piecing together what happened. In Washington, David Schuster, Fox News.
It is almost 2 a.m. on the East Coast, and still there is new information that continues to come in on this story. We want to show you a picture of the LA Times website. And look at that man on the left-hand side. He may be, and this may be the very first picture of one of the pilots who hijacked one of those planes that caused so much despair and devastation. His name is Amanullah Atta Mohammed, and this is a man who apparently paid $10,000 to go to a flight school, the Huffman Aviation International Flight School, down in Venice, Florida, a story that we've been telling you about throughout the day.
And the Huffman School is one of 3 flight schools in Florida that the FBI has been looking into. They've been asking for information about the students who were passengers, and apparently, according to the LA Times, this man who you're looking at, Amanullah Atta Mohammed, paid $10,000 along with another fella to attend this Huffman International Flight School. And apparently, according to one of the folks who works there, he came in literally through the front door and claimed to be an Afghani citizen who entered this country from Germany. That is the claim.
Now, Rudy Deckers, who is the owner of Huffman Aviation International, again, based in Venice, Florida, said, quote, and this is according to the LA Times, they said they were not happy with another flight school, and so they obtained their licenses here and left, and they went to South Florida for jet training. He says they were normal students and worked very hard. They lived nearby and bicycled here every day. Deckers said that one of the 2 men said he wanted to learn to fly jumbo jets. That is a picture of Amanullah Atta Mohammed, and apparently he paid $10,000 along with another man to go to a flight school down in South Florida called Huffman Aviation, and this picture again comes to you from the LA Times. All right, we'll continue to follow this story and all the angles for you, but first we want to talk to you about the way that America's responded to this tragedy, because it really has been remarkable.
It has been. People talk about the spirit, the triumph of the human spirit, people pulling together. We're certainly seeing that in New York and in Washington and in really all over the country. John Dupree has more.
Once the jewels of New York's skyline, the World Trade Center towers stood up against terrorism long enough to save countless lives.
The plane came through, it took out a few of the exterior columns of the building and then set off this massive fire with the jet fuel. And fortunately, because of the perimeter tube system of the building, it was able to withstand the initial impact and allow a lot of people to get out.
Other buildings would have toppled immediately, but the towers remained upright for nearly an hour, supported on the outside by closely spaced steel columns and struts, and on the inside by a second set of columns designed to bear the load of gravity. A double support system that withstood the crash, but not the raging jet fuel fire.
The girders or the joists that hold up the floors collapsed, and as those fell to the floor below, they overwhelmed the capacity of that floor, and we had what we call a progressive collapse, which then continued on through the base of the building until it was a complete and total failure.
Most experts say tall buildings will continue to be made out of steel. What may change, they say, is the design of signature skyscrapers, the tallest and most exposed buildings. They may never be built in quite the same way.
It's not like we could ever design every building for this scenario, or should we? But after every major earthquake, for example, we change our building codes to improve our practice in the future, and I would expect a similar thing will happen here.
One possibility, designs that include more escape routes around the perimeter of the building as well as in the center. But experts say no building can withstand an attack by a pilot willing to die for a cause. The challenge ahead, simply finding ways to reduce the loss of life. In San Francisco, Claudia Cowan, Fox News.
All right, well, we apologize. Clearly, that was not John Dupree. That was Claudia Cowan reporting.
All right. Now let's take a look at the story from John Dupree about the spirit of America.
An extraordinary disaster, a remarkable response. It wasn't just New Yorkers lining up around the block to give blood.
They'll call you when you're ready.
In the first 6 hours after the attacks, 700,000 Americans volunteered to roll up their sleeves.
It's been overwhelming. The outpouring of love and support from the community is really heartfelt.
This Red Cross Center has seen record numbers of blood donors. Many realize their blood may not be used by East Coast victims, but it doesn't matter.
It could have been me, and if, God forbid, it happened here in one of our buildings, I sure hope people in New York would be helping us out as well.
I know it's a horrible, horrible thing, but, it's nice to be part of a community of people who are really willing to help.
The crisis has sparked an explosion of patriotism as Americans rally around the flag.
Flag and banner, may I help you?
This store sold 200 Star-Spangled Banners before noon Wednesday.
The United States flag represents freedom, represents the lives that have been lost for our freedom, for our independence.
Americans want to do something, anything, to help and to show their support for the victims.
We'll just take 15 seconds starting right now, and just a quick moment of silence.
1,500 radio stations went silent at 8:42 a.m., 24 hours after the first plane struck. Churches, synagogues, and mosques report enormous turnout at special worship services. Religious and civic groups are raising countless dollars through money drives, all in response to an act of violence meant to terrorize, but one which in its
say that it's not just one man, it's not just Osama bin Laden. He is the head of a network called Al-Qaeda, and that means a lot of different groups of various nationalities that could be involved in this attack. And I think we're seeing that now as the investigations are turning up individuals of various nationalities who could be suspects in these attacks. Anyway, this is our view from Islamabad, Pakistan. Things could be heating up here in the days to come. Rick, Lori.
Greg Palcott. Thanks very much, Greg. Greg joining us on the phone from Pakistan. Tuesday's assaults on the World Trade Center Tower and the Pentagon, the worst attacks of their kind in history.
And indeed, so many questions remain. And now joining us to perhaps shed some light on what is happening now, we're joined by William Daley, a former FBI investigator who now runs Control Risks Group. Thanks so much for being with us tonight, Bill.
All right, thanks for having me in.
And, we're hearing these reports that Osama bin Laden may be under house arrest, and you heard Greg Palcott reporting that some of the rulers of the Taliban may be leaving their posts. What do you make of all this?
Well, first of all, I think there's a couple of ploys underfoot here. We saw the same thing go on in Libya when we were looking for the accused masterminds behind the downing of Pan Am 103, when they said they're here, and until you can prove that they are responsible for it, we're going to keep them here. We'll hold on to them. You know, so we start to have this positioning by which maybe it gives people some time, some distance, puts maybe the United States in a very difficult position, maybe internationally, to start saying, well, they're going to hand him over to you, then, you know, why are you going after him? But I think we have to look beyond this and realize that they're really just ploys, and they're really just moves to be able to put things off a little bit longer.
Bill, one of the first things that everyone agrees needs to be done is the information needs to be gathered. We need to figure out exactly who is responsible for this before there's any kind of retaliatory attack. So the information gathering has already begun, but from your standpoint and with your area of expertise, how is that done? What's going on right now inside the FBI? We saw the storming of the hotels in Boston today. How is all of this information being gathered, and how is the work being done?
Well, Rick, as they've said, this is the largest investigation that they've had, that they've ever done. And I can only imagine, because I know some of the people that are there, the daunting task ahead of them.
And there's a brand new director.
Brand new director. Obviously, the Bureau coming out from concerns over some past issues that have arisen between files being missing and some other issues. But you can see that they are pulling together as an organized, unified effort and moving very quickly through this investigation. My thoughts when I first heard about this, and actually saw it here when I was in the studio when it was breaking, was that this has such a wide base of support that it's not going to take too much to be able to follow those footprints in the sand and start to put this together. Normally you start looking at crime scenes, and you use the crime scene evidence to then help you perhaps find people responsible. In this case, is that the people who conducted this had to do things that were more overt, which we're finding out now, and we're actually backing into the investigation from eyewitnesses and other people coming forward and other information from manifests, which is helping move this thing along very quickly.
And it's looking like whoever was responsible for this does have ties to Osama bin Laden. Obviously, we can't confirm anything. We want to be very careful not to indict this man right away. But if it turns out to be, how do we get this guy? He is very tricky. He comes out when he wants to come out, but he's very well hidden, perhaps by the Taliban. So how do we get him, and at what point do you just start attacking places where he is known to have been in the past?
Well, certainly that's one approach. Is that one approach might be, to go after known places where he has been, and training camps where they may have trained people, places where they've recruited people. There's a variety of sites that U.S. intelligence already knows about from their investigation of the USS Cole, from the embassy bombing investigation. So there is a lot of information out there that U.S. intelligence has. The question is, where is he at any one day? We've seen that even from the bombings of during the Gulf War, is that Saddam Hussein moved around, and there were locations where U.S. intelligence thought that he was present, and he was able to avoid and evade, U.S. warplanes. So we can kind of see the same mentality when someone moves around. But we have to say is that someone like this, is that we will get him. We will get him one way or the other if he's responsible. And it may require some additional work and effort to locate exactly where he is. But I am confident that with the resources of not only U.S., but of other countries that are supportive of us, we will get him.
It's so strange here, if he is responsible, bin Laden, because it's not as though this is the leader of some foreign nation. This is the leader of some very widespread terrorist network with cells of people, and we're learning cells of people right here in our country.
Exactly, Rick. I mean, and I think the most difficult thing for people, for Americans to realize is that, we have brought people into this country who we now are finding out had some records, had some association in the past with either him or other terrorist groups. We've allowed them in. We allow them to go for training in our country, to go for pilot training. We allow them to, go on, get jobs, and allow them then eventually to have this occur. So I think when we start looking down the road, we're going to have to look outside the box. We've been working very in the past with a certain set of values, a certain set of ways we do things. But after this, we all need to be looking outside the box in all the ways that we gather intelligence.
So what does that include?